My son's wife called it garbage. She held up the cedar box at his retirement party, laughed, and said, "What is this?" Some kind of joke. Then she dropped it into the recycling bin like it was an empty cereal box. My son stood right beside her and said nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I walked over to that blue bin, reached past the paper napkins and empty wine bottles, and took the box back. Then I put on my coat, said goodnight to no one in particular, and drove home alone on the 401 inches the dark. The next morning, I walked into my branch at TD Bank on King Street. The teller looked at the documents I slid across the counter, typed something, looked at her screen, typed again, and then quietly said, I need to call our private banking director. Please don't go anywhere." Hey, before we go any further, have you ever been dismissed because of what you do for a living? Not who you are, just what you do. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. Now, back to what happened at that bank. The retirement party had been held at the Whitmore, a restored heritage event venue north of Toronto in King Township. My daughter-in-law had chosen it because it appeared in every upscale Ontario wedding magazine published in the last 3 years. White limestone exterior, original wide plank floors, a wraparound porch that photographed beautifully at golden hour. She'd spent 8 months planning the event. 200 guests, a catered dinner from a Michelin-recommended chef out of Yorkville, a custom cake that cost more than my first month's mortgage payment. My son, Daniel, was retiring after 22 years as a portfolio manager at a Bay Street investment firm. He was 54 years old, fit, silver-templed, the kind of man who had grown into exactly the life his wife had designed for him. I was proud of him. I had always been proud of him. I arrived at the Whitmore that evening in the dress I'd bought at Reitman's 3 years ago for my neighbor's daughter's wedding. Beige, sensible. I'd pressed it carefully the night before. I carried the cedar box in both hands, the way you carry something old and irreplaceable. Which is exactly what it was. My daughter-in-law, Christine, greeted me at the door with that particular smile she reserved for people she felt obligated to acknowledge. She was 46, polished in a way that required daily maintenance, and had made it clear within the first year of their marriage that she found my presence at family events mildly inconvenient. "Margaret," she air-kissed beside my cheek. "You made it." As though the drive from Mississauga was an expedition, I found Daniel near the bar with his former colleagues. He hugged me, asked if I'd eaten, and was absorbed back into conversation within 90 seconds. I sat at a table near the windows and watched the room. I waited until the dinner plates had been cleared and the speeches were winding down. Then I carried the cedar box to where Daniel and Christine stood near the fireplace, accepting congratulations from the last cluster of guests. "Daniel." I held the box out toward him. "I wanted to give you this tonight." Christine turned. Her eyes moved from my face to the box, and I saw that small recalibration happen, the one where people decide how much attention something deserves based on how it looks. The cedar was dark and worn, the brass clasp tarnished to a deep amber. It didn't look like much. "What is it?" Daniel asked. And he was genuinely curious, which gave me a moment of warmth. Before I could answer, Christine reached over and lifted the lid. Inside was a folded paper, an account statement from a trust account at TD Bank, and beneath it, a smaller envelope I'd sealed with wax. Christine unfolded the statement, scanned it, and her expression shifted to something between confusion and amusement. She held it up toward her husband with 2 fingers. The way you'd hold a child's crayon drawing, you weren't sure what to do with. What is this? Some kind of joke. Daniel looked at the paper. Looked at me. And for a moment, I saw something cross his face that I recognized embarrassment. Not for me. For himself. At being put in this position. Mom! This is a trust account statement. His voice was careful. From 1,989. It's current. I said quietly. Christine laughed. Not cruelly. Exactly more with the absolute confidence of a woman who had never needed to worry about money in her adult life, and therefore found other people's financial instruments mildly absurd. It's an old paper account. Margaret! This is so sweet. But we don't really. She set it on the mantel. Picked up the cedar box, and I watched her walk it across the room and drop it into the large blue recycling bin stationed near the catering table. There, she smiled at me. I'll make sure someone takes care of it. The room had moved on. 2 guests near the bar were laughing about something. The catering staff were clearing glasses. Daniel put his hand briefly on my shoulder, not an apology. Just a gesture, and turned back to his colleagues. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked to the recycling bin. Reached past the folded napkins and an empty Pellegrino bottle. And lifted out the cedar box. I tucked it under my arm. Said goodnight to the room in general. Collected my coat from the attendant at the door. And drove home. The 401 westbound was quiet for a Thursday night. I kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. I had learned a long time ago that silence was better for thinking than noise. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in my Mississauga townhouse, the one I'd owned since 1991, and I set the cedar box in front of me. I opened it and looked at what it held. The trust statement. The sealed envelope. A photograph of a downtown Toronto street corner taken sometime in the early 1980s, and underneath everything else, a folded document I had placed there 15 years ago and not touched since I unfolded it. A property summary from my accountant. Updated the previous spring. 41 commercial and residential properties across the Greater Toronto Area and Simcoe County. Current assessed portfolio value $28 million. I had started in 1981. I was 31 years old. Recently divorced. Working the night cleaning shift at an office tower on University Avenue, and raising Daniel in a 1-bedroom apartment in Etobicoke on a cleaner's wages and whatever I could set aside each week, in a paper savings account at the TD branch on Bloor Street. I had overheard 2 men in suits talking in a boardroom. I was vacuuming one evening. They were discussing a foreclosed duplex in Parkdale that the bank was looking to offload. The price was low because the building needed work, and the neighborhood, at the time, had a certain reputation among people who lived in other neighborhoods. I bought it. Every dollar I'd saved. Plus a small loan from my mother. Plus 6 months of the most uncomfortable conversations I ever had with a mortgage officer who kept asking me to explain again what exactly I did for work. I fixed the plumbing myself using a library book. I learned drywall on YouTube before YouTube existed, which is to say I learned it from a retired tradesman named Frank who lived on the ground floor and taught me in exchange for reduced rent. Both units were rented within 30 days to families who needed affordable housing and took care of the place like it was their own. Because it was. That duplex paid for the next property. The next paid for the one after that. $200 a month became $500, became $2,000, became the quiet accumulation of something that nobody around me could see because I had never worn it. I didn't tell Daniel. He was a child, and then a teenager, and then a young man making his own way, and the money never felt like something to announce. I paid for his university. He thought it was a combination of scholarships and loans I'd managed somehow. I made sure he had what he needed. But I wanted him to build his own life, on his own terms. Not on the assumption of mine. I kept cleaning offices. I liked the work. I liked the stillness of buildings at night. The order that came from making something clean that had been disordered. There is a dignity in that kind of work that the people who've never done it don't understand, and the people who do it every day understand completely. I made one large purchase in 2006 that Daniel knew nothing about. The Whitmore. It had been a failing event venue, then overextended renovation debt. An absentee owner, 3 consecutive years of operating losses. Everyone said it was a bad investment. I bought it for $2.8 million through my holding company. MBC Properties, Inc. My initials. My company. I installed a management team. Restructured the bookings calendar. And within 4 years it was operating at full capacity every weekend, from May through October. My daughter-in-law had chosen the Whitmore for my son's retirement party because it was the most prestigious venue in King Township. Because it photographed well. Because it signaled a certain arrival. The flagstone patio she'd used for cocktail hour. The original pine floors Daniel had stood on while accepting congratulations from his Bay Street colleagues. The wraparound porch Christine had used as a backdrop for photographs. All of it belonged to me. I looked at the property summary for a long time. Then I put it back in the cedar box. Went to bed. And slept without any difficulty at all. The next morning, I was at the TD branch before it opened. The private banking director's name was Anita Sharma. She was in her late 40s. Practical and precise. And had been managing significant accounts long enough that nothing surprised her very much. She looked at the trust statement. Looked at her screen. I looked at me over her reading glasses. Mrs. Calloway. She set the paper down carefully. This account has been open since 1989. You've made consistent contributions for 35 years. Briefpause. You've never made a withdrawal. That's correct. The current balance, with accumulated interest and reinvested dividends, she consulted her screen, is $9.3 million. I had known the number within a reasonable margin. Hearing it said aloud in a bank office on a Tuesday morning still had a certain quality to it. I'd like to restructure the account, I said, and I need the name of someone reliable. A private investigator. Someone who handles financial matters. Anita didn't blink. In her experience, wealthy clients asked for stranger things before noon. She wrote a name and a number on the back of a business card and slid it across the desk. Martin Beauchamp. Former RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. He's handled sensitive work for a number of our clients. You can use my name. I thanked her. Left the branch. And by that afternoon I had a meeting scheduled with Martin Beauchamp for the following morning. Martin Beauchamp looked like the kind of man who had spent decades being underestimated, which made him very good at his job. He was 63. Broad-shouldered but dressed quietly. With a handshake that was firm without being demonstrative. We met at a Tim Hortons on Dundas West because he liked Tim Hortons, and I had no objection. Your daughter-in-law, he said. Opening a folder, Christine Alderton Calloway. 46. Prior to her marriage to your son, she worked in real estate marketing. Stopped working in 2009. He looked at me. I've had 5 days. You may not like what I found. Tell me. He laid out the documents in the methodical way of someone trained to present evidence rather than editorial. Christine Hell, for the past 4 years, been conducting what could most accurately be described as a quiet financial extraction from my son's household. Credit accounts in both names. Balances. Daniel didn't know about. A line of credit against their Rosedale home, drawn down by $260,000 collateral on a private investment she'd made in a development project in Collingwood that had since collapsed. An investment made without Daniel's knowledge or signature. which raised questions that Martin said I should ask a lawyer about rather than him. Your son? Martin's voice was steady. His pension and severance from the firm are considerable, but his personal savings, he paused. And I understood that pause to mean what it meant are not what he believes them to be. I sat with that for a moment. The Tim Hortons was busy. A man in a Go Transit jacket was eating a breakfast sandwich at the counter. Two women in scrubs were splitting a box of Timbits. Normal Wednesday morning in Mississauga. Is Daniel aware? Not as far as I can determine. She's been careful. The accounts are structured to look like ordinary household debt, and the Collingwood investment, the project folded 14 months ago. She lost the capital. That money is gone. I thought about my son. 22 years at the same firm, careful and disciplined. Good at his work. Retiring at 54 because he believed he and his wife had built something solid together. What do you recommend? Martin closed the folder. That depends what you want to do. Mrs. Calloway. I thought about the recycling bin. The cedar box. The laugh. I want my son to know the truth. I said, but from someone he can't dismiss. I called Daniel that evening. He sounded tired in the way people sound when something is wrong, and they haven't yet identified what. I told him I wanted to have lunch. He said that would be fine. That he'd been meaning to call. We agreed on Saturday at a restaurant in Oakville he liked. Halfway between his house and mine. Before Saturday, I made 2 other calls. The first was to my solicitor. A woman named Patricia Okafor, who had handled my real estate transactions for 16 years and was not easily rattled. I told her what Martin had found. She listened, asked 4 questions, and told me to have Martin send her everything. She said words like fiduciary obligation and undisclosed liability, and said she would have a clearer picture within 72 hours. The second call was to the management director at the Whitmore, James. I said, I've made a decision about the property. I want to convert it. A pause. Convert it. Affordable housing. Mixed income. I'm thinking 48 units. Priority placement for essential workers, nurses, teachers, BSVs, tradespeople. I looked at the kitchen table. At the cedar box sitting in the evening, light, people who've been priced out of this part of the province. Another pause. Longer this time. Margaret. That venue is fully booked through next autumn. We're profitable. We've been profitable for 15 years. I know. But profitable isn't the only measure of a thing. I looked at the property summary I'd unfolded the night before. Start the conversion process. I'll want preliminary plans within 3 weeks. James was quiet for a moment. Then, you've already decided. I decided the night someone dropped the deed into a recycling bin. He said he'd have preliminary proposals to me by the end of the month. Lunch with Daniel was at a restaurant overlooking the lake. It was a bright October Saturday. The kind of afternoon that makes you remember why you live in this part of the country, even through February. He was already seated when I arrived. He stood to hug me. And I noticed he held on a beat longer than usual. We talked about small things for a while. The food, his plans for retirement, whether he and Christine were thinking about travel. His answers had a careful quality, the quality of someone who has been rehearsing a version of their life to present to people. After the plates were cleared, I set the cedar box on the table. He looked at it. Mom! Open it. He lifted the lid slowly this time. Read the trust statement. Looked up at me. $9.3 million. Yes. He set the paper down. How? I told him. Not everything at once. But the shape of it, the duplex in Parkdale in 1982, the properties that followed. The portfolio that had grown quietly over 4 decades while I was working nights on University Avenue. I watched my son's face move through confusion and then something more complex, not quite shame, but a close relation. You let me think, I let you build your own life. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. The Whitmore. Yes. He looked out at the lake. Christine chose it because I know why she chose it. A long pause. What does that mean? I placed Martin Beauchamp's report folder on the table beside the cedar box. It means your retirement party was held in a building your mother owns, and it also means there are some things about your household finances that you deserve to know. I watched my son read Martin's report, the way you watch someone receive difficult news, the initial composure, the moment where something starts to shift behind the eyes. The stillness that follows. He didn't speak for several minutes. The lake was flat and bright outside the window. A family of 4 walked past on the path below. 2 kids running ahead. Parents walking close together. $260,000. His voice was very quiet. Patricia Okafor is reviewing the legal dimensions. The signature questions are significant. She made investment decisions without your knowledge or consent. On collateral, secured against your home. He closed the folder, set his hands flat on the table. I recognized this gesture. It was the same one he'd used as a boy when he was trying to understand something that hadn't resolved into a shape he could hold. Did you know before the party? I suspected enough to ask Martin to look. I had the full picture 2 days before. And you didn't tell me. I needed you to read it in black and white. I said, not hear it from your mother. He looked at me then. And I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the managed distance look he'd developed over years of his wife's social architecture. Something more direct. I didn't defend you, he said. At the party? No. When Christine, I know what happened. He pushed the report folder slowly to one side. I'm sorry. Mom? I looked at my son. 54 years old. Silver-templed. The product of every night shift I had ever worked, and every decision I had ever made in a vacant boardroom with a vacuum in my hand. I know you are. I said, what you do next will matter more than the apology. He called Christine from the parking lot. I sat in my car and gave him his privacy. I could see him through the windshield standing straight. Very still. The measured voice of a man in the financial industry who had learned to keep his register level when the numbers were bad. The call lasted 11 minutes. When he came back, he sat in the passenger seat and looked at the dashboard for a moment. She didn't deny it. I didn't say anything. She said it was for us. That she was trying to build something for our future. He paused. She said you'd been poisoning my mind against her for years. Has she met Patricia Okafor? Not yet. She will. He turned to look at me. The Whitmore. You're really converting it. 48 units. Essential workers. BSVs. Nurses. Teachers. Tradespeople. The kind of people who've been commuting 90 minutes each way from Barrie because they can't afford anything closer. Daniel was quiet for a moment. She threw your cedar box away. She threw away something she didn't understand. That's a different thing. He looked at me for a long time. What can I do? Go home. Talk to Patricia. Figure out what your marriage actually is. I looked at him steadily. And when you're ready, come help me build something that matters. He nodded slowly. Then he got out of the car and stood for a moment in the parking lot, looking out at the lake. I waited until he got into his own car before I drove away. Patricia Okafor's assessment took 10 days. At the end of it, the summary was straightforward. Unauthorized use of jointly held collateral. Undisclosed liability. Potential breach of fiduciary duty within the marital estate. Not criminal, but civilly significant. The kind of thing that, in a divorce proceeding, creates a very particular conversation about asset division. Christine did not contest the findings. Patricia told me later that she had arrived at the initial meeting composed and left considerably less so. She had apparently believed that the extent of the financial situation was not fully documented. It was fully documented. My son filed for separation in November. The process was not simple and it was not clean. But it was honest, which is the best you can hope for. I did not celebrate any of this. I want to be clear about that. A marriage ending is not a victory. My son going through the mechanics of untangling a life built with someone that is not something to feel satisfied about. I felt the weight of it every time he called. Which was more often now. We talked in the evenings. Sometimes just for 20 minutes. About nothing in particular. The way we had talked when he was in university. The way we had stopped talking for reasons that had accumulated slowly and were nobody's single fault. The demolition crew arrived at the Whitmore on the second Monday of November. I was there at 7 in the morning with coffee from the Tim Hortons on Davis Drive. Wearing steel-toed boots I'd bought at the Marks on Yonge Street. The site foreman, a man named Ray Charbonneau, who had been in construction for 30 years, looked at the heritage limestone exterior and then looked at me. "You understand this building has been here since 1887. I do. The heritage designation means the facade stays. We're restructuring the interior." "I know. That's in the plans." He looked at the blueprints. Then, back at the building, 48 units. Mixed income. Teachers. Nurses. PSVs. Tradespeople. Preference for applicants who've been on the York Region Affordable Housing waitlist. Ray was quiet for a moment. "Then my daughter's a PSW. Been on that list for 2.5 years. Then she should apply." He looked at me with a directness that I recognized as a particular kind of respect, the kind that comes from people who work with their hands and extend it only when they feel it. "All right. Mrs. Calloway. Let's get started." Daniel arrived at the site on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks into demolition. He was wearing jeans and work boots that were clearly new. He stood at the construction entrance, looking at what used to be the main hall of the Whitmore. Now, open framing and bare concrete. And I watched him do the math. This was the room where 200 people had congratulated him on his retirement. Where the bar had been set up. Where Christine had stood in a dress that cost $4,000. "I didn't know it was yours," he said. "You didn't ask." He turned to look at me. "That sounds like a criticism." "It's an observation." I handed him a hard hat from the pile near the entrance. "Do you want to do something useful?" He put on the hard hat. "What do you need?" Over the following months, Daniel came to the site twice a week. He was not a tradesman. He had worked in an office for 2 decades, but he was disciplined, and he listened to, and he learned quickly how to be useful without being in the way. He reviewed supplier contracts, using skills from the Bay Street years. He handled permit documentation. He drove materials when they needed moving. He drank bad coffee from a thermos and ate lunch with the crew on the tailgate of Ray's pickup truck, and did not mention that he used to eat at restaurants where the wine list was the size of a magazine. In February, he brought me coffee one morning and sat across from me at the folding table in the site office, which was a repurposed equipment trailer that smelled like sawdust and diesel. "I looked into the Parkdale duplex," he said. "I looked up from the permit file I was reviewing, the one you bought in 1982. I found the property records online." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "You paid $42,000. The current valuation is listed at $1.1 million. It was good bones." I said, "Mom?" He set the coffee down. "I spent 22 years managing other people's money, and I never once asked about yours." I looked at my son. You were building your own life. I was building Christine's version of my life. He was quiet for a moment. There's a difference. I understand that now. Outside. The sound of the framing crew, working on the third floor. The smell of fresh lumber. The slow, accumulative sound of something being built. I used to be embarrassed. Daniel said, when I was young, that you cleaned offices. I know. The other kids at school I know. Daniel. He was quiet. I was wrong. I was a child and I was wrong and I carried it longer than I should have. I looked at him for a moment. The night I cleaned that boardroom on University Avenue. I overheard the men who gave me this. I gestured around the construction trailer, at the blueprints on the wall, at the permit file in my hand. Everything I've built started because I was in that room with a vacuum in my hand and nobody thought I was worth noticing. That invisibility was an advantage. I used it for 40 years. Daniel looked at the blueprints, and Christine dropped it in a recycling bin. She threw away something she didn't understand. I picked up my coffee. She wasn't the first. The opening of Whitmore Commons, the name we'd chosen because it was what the building was now common. In the best sense. Belonging to everyone, was held on a Saturday in June. The heritage limestone facade was intact. The wide pine floors, salvaged and refinished, ran through the central hallway. 48 apartments, each with a proper kitchen and a window that looked onto either the courtyard garden or the concession road lined with old maples. The York Region Housing Authority had managed the application process. Priority to essential workers. Ray's daughter, Sandra Charbonneau, a PSW who had been driving from Barrie to Bradford every day for 2.5 years, received the keys to Unit 14. I stood near the main entrance as families carried boxes in. Daniel was beside me in a Whitmore Commons property management jacket that he'd put on without being asked. He'd been working formally as operations coordinator for 3 months. He had taken a salary of exactly $1 and said he'd reconsider when he'd earned it. I hadn't argued. A woman in her late 50s approached us. She was carrying a box labeled kitchen in careful block letters. A teenage boy trailing behind her with a backpack. Mrs. Calloway. She stopped. Her name was Yvonne Tremblay. She had been a registered nurse at Southlake Regional for 21 years. She'd been on the affordable housing waitlist since 2020. I just wanted to say. She stopped. Looked at the building. Looked back at me. Her eyes were wet. We've been in a basement apartment in Newmarket with mold in the bathroom ceiling for 4 years. My son has asthma. She pressed her lips together. Thank you. I shook her hand. You earned your place here. Your application showed 21 years of full-time nursing and a spotless record. You didn't need charity. You needed a fair chance. She nodded, picked up her box, and headed toward Unit 7. Her son followed. And near the door, he turned and looked back at the building, the way teenagers sometimes look at things when they think no one is watching, with a kind of unguarded hope. Daniel watched them go. He was quiet for a moment. The people on those application forms, he said, they're not abstractions. They never were. I know that now. He looked at the building. I think I'm beginning to understand what you've been building. What do you think it is? He thought about it. Not money. No. Not revenge either. No. He turned to look at me. Purpose. That's the word. We stood there as more families moved in. A man in a GO Transit uniform carried a child's bicycle up the front steps. 2 nurses from Southlake walked in together pulling a shared cart, laughing about something. A retired teacher, 70 years old and small and precise, paused at the entrance to read the plaque we'd placed beside the door. The plaque said, Whitmore Commons. Built 1887. Rebuilt 2026. For the people who keep the lights on, Daniel read it from where we stood. Did you write that Ray Charbonneau wrote it? I just agreed with it. My son looked at the plaque for a long moment. Then he turned to face me fully. Not the managed distance look. The direct one. Have I earned anything back yet? I thought about the Cedar box. The recycling bin. The retirement party. The 11 months between then and now. The Wednesday mornings at the site with bad coffee and genuine work. The way he'd sat with Yvonne Tremblay's application for 20 minutes the previous week. Reading it twice. Making sure the details were right. You're earning it every day. I said. That's not the same thing as having it back. But it's the right direction. He nodded once. And I could see it cost him something, not the answer he'd wanted. But the honest one. And he knew the difference. That knowing was itself a kind of answer. My phone rang. Patricia Okafor. I held up a hand to Daniel and answered. The final settlement was signed this morning. Patricia said. It's done. Thank you. Patricia. I hung up and looked at my son. He'd heard enough to understand. It's over, he asked. The legal part? Yes. He exhaled slowly. Not relief. Exactly. The particular quality of air, leaving a room where something heavy had been sitting for a long time. What comes next? I looked at the building. Families moving in. Boxes on shoulders. Children running ahead down the central hallway. The sound of a life being assembled. Unit by unit. From the ground up. We've got 2 properties in Simcoe County. I've been thinking about converting. Same model. Teachers and healthcare workers are commuting 2 hours each way from Barrie and Aurelia. I looked at him. I could use someone who knows how to read a contract. He looked at the Whitmore Commons facade limestone that had stood for 139 years. Reborn into something different but continuous. Something that would outlast both of us. What time Monday? He asked. 7. And bring your own coffee. The site trailer thermos has not improved. He almost smiled. It was small and real and mine. That evening, I drove back to my townhouse in Mississauga. The one I'd owned for 35 years. And I sat at the kitchen table and set the Cedar box in front of me. I lifted the lid. The trust statement was still there. $9.3 million. Untouched. Below it, the sealed envelope I'd placed inside years ago. I had written Daniel's name on it in 1998. I hadn't touched it since. It held a letter, a full accounting of everything I'd built. Property by property. Dollar by dollar. And the reason I'd kept it quiet for so long, the reason, which took me several drafts to say correctly, was this. I had wanted to know who he would become when he didn't know what he stood to inherit. I had my answer. I placed the Cedar box back on the shelf above the fireplace, in the space I'd kept clear for it for 30 years. Then I went to bed. And the radiator clicked steadily in the way it had for 3 decades. And outside a car passed on the street below. And I slept without difficulty. Tomorrow I would go to work. Not because I needed to, because there were 240 families on a wait list in Simcoe County who needed someone to show up, because my son was going to be there at 7 o'clock Monday morning with his own coffee and his real face on, learning what it means to build something that lasts. And because somewhere on a shelf in a townhouse in Mississauga, a Cedar box was waiting for the day its letter finally got delivered. Not yet, but soon. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you've ever worked a job that made someone else look past you, or loved someone who took too long to see you clearly, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it. The people who clean the offices and drive the buses and sit with the sick at 3 in the morning don't talk about what they're building. But they're building it every day. Subscribe to Gemstone Revenge for more stories about ordinary people who turned quiet strength into something extraordinary. Leave a comment below, I read every one. And remember, it was never just a cedar box. It was 40 years of showing up,